Well, the last time we met, Laban had Jacob take his animals, and he wanted to shepherd them in a separate place. So he was going to stay with him another 6 years and try to grow his flocks. And we learned that Jacob was blessed because he said, I'll give you all my speckled one. Then we know that Laban means white. Laban means white. So he didn't like speckled and striped animals, so he was willing to give them to Jacob as long as he could get the solid colors. Well, what happened was Jacob heard from the Lord. We're going to find that out tonight, and I'll point it out when we get there. But there was a strange passage where he carved sticks out. They had dark bark, and the meat of the wood was white, so he would make speckles on pieces of wood, and he would have them stare at it while they were mating, and they would end up with a speckled animal. And so Jacob's flocks grew and Laban's shrunk. Then you would have a strong sheep and then another weakling. Well, he would have the weakling go with another weakling, and the stronger one would mate with the strong. So now Laban's got all these weak sheep. They're all solids. And the speckled sheep are these massive animals that were beautiful and worth more money and everything. So for 6 years, he bred these animals to where Laban was losing money and he was gaining money. Laban, his sons start getting mad because they're watching what's going on and saying that Jacob is stealing our father's money and his wealth. So we're going to see them start talking negatively about it. Last week we saw Jacob split the herds of Laban and make his own herd grow large. Laban's not so much. Jacob and his wives are ready to go out on their own to get away from Laban and working for his prosperity. Jacob's wives and children have very little that Laban couldn't claim as his own and leave them with almost nothing. We even see Laban's sons starting to say that Jacob had stolen their father's wealth. So they're ready, at 107, he's ready to leave home with his family. And so even his wives are saying, look, my dad owns everything and he could come and take it from us at any time because these are still his flocks. So 31:1. Now Jacob heard the words of Laban's sons, saying, Jacob has taken away all that was our father's, and from what was our father's he has acquired all his wealth. So whatever Laban gave him, he made it grow, and they're saying that all of his stuff is being taken away. And Jacob saw the countenance of Laban, and indeed it was not favorable towards him as before. And then the Lord said to Jacob, return to the land of your fathers and to your family, and I will be with you. So he's hearing from God, and he says, go home. Now you have to remember that at home, Esau is waiting to kill him. But God is saying to go home. So this is kind of a faith exercise to where he has to decide at 107 with all these kids and wives, am I going to take my family home and put them in danger, or am I going to stay here and be robbed by Laban because he kept changing his wages? Every time he would see spotted ones grow, he'd say, well, you can have the striped ones. Every time he would see the striped ones grow, he'd give them some other wages that he was going to pay him. And he gripes about it a little later on. We'll get there. But now God is telling him to go home. And I will be with you. So he's getting reassurance now from God. So Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah to the field to his flock, and said to them, I see your father's countenance, that it is not favorable towards me as before, but the God of my father has been with me. And you know that with all of my might I have served your father. Now, I've done the best I can, and now God is going to release me from any oaths I might have taken or anything like that. When Jacob notices the demeanor change between Laban and himself, he's ready to go. In verse 3, we see the Lord tell Jacob to return to his home and to his family, and God would be with him. Now remember, Esau had sworn to kill Jacob for stealing his blessing, but now God said to move. One thing for us to contemplate is, if God told us where to go where it was not safe, would we trust him? All through the Bible, we see people told to do something God has blessed, but then fall short to follow him. Most of the time, we say we're doing something for God, that he has no part in, and expect him to bless it. Verse 7. Yet your father has deceived me and changed my wages 10 times, but God did not allow him to hurt me. Now this number 10 just means a lot. Doesn't necessarily have to mean 10 exactly 10. But when you see the number 10, it's usually all the time. He's changing my wages. If he says thus, the speckled shall be your wages, then all the flocks bore speckled. And if he said, the streaked shall be your wages, then all the flocks bore streaked. So God has taken away the livestock of your father and given them to me. He's given credit to God for this. In other words, all this putting the sticks in front and all that kind of stuff was him obeying what he was told to do, but he's giving God the credit, the glory for it. And it happened at the time when the flocks conceived that I lifted my eyes and saw in a dream, and behold, the rams which leaped upon the flocks were streaked, speckled, and gray spotted. See, before in the last chapter, we never did know why he carved these sticks out. There's like 6 or 7 verses there where he carved the sticks out, let them, the goats and the animal lambs and stuff, see the sticks, and they would bear these speckled children. We're saying, well, is this superstition, or is this really true, a scientific thing? Well, I couldn't find anything on any of it, but now he's saying he had a dream and God told him to do this.
Supernatural.
So it was a supernatural thing, and as long as he followed what God told him to do, he was blessed. Does that strike a chord with anybody? You know?
Yeah.
Okay. Jacob is speaking with his wives, explaining why he is ready to go. Notice he gives the glory to God by saying he did not allow Laban to hurt him. Verse 8 tells us more information about Laban, in which he changed the deal many times when Laban saw Jacob was winning. When Laban changed Jacob's wages, God would bless Jacob accordingly. In verse 9, Jacob gives the glory to God for taking the livestock from Laban. This is just another example that God blesses those that he blesses. David was blessed until he committed adultery and murder. Solomon was blessed without measure until he allowed idol worship in Israel. If we do not follow God's commands and worship and love him, there is no reason we will not have a blessed life. I wanted to kind of pause here just a minute with current events and say, when Solomon was God's man, he was blessed beyond measure. Supposedly the richest man that ever lived on the planet. Had more gold, more everything than any man on the planet. Well, then he started marrying these wives that were foreign. He had 700 wives and 300 concubines. And to keep them happy, he let them worship their own gods. So they brought their own idols and their own temples. They built temples in Israel. Nathan the prophet came to Solomon and said, this is not going to go. You've got to get this out of the country. And he said, more or less, I can do what I want to, and I want to keep them happy. I want to go along to get along, and all this. Solomon was removed, and Rehoboam was put in, who was a sorry king. They hadn't even been to war any time during Solomon's time. There was nothing but good times. But because, you see, God told Solomon personally, as long as you follow my commands, I will love you. So he started going against God, and he took him out of the picture. We need to be a little bit concerned when we say, well, I'll go this far, but not that. Whenever we start putting limits on God, you have agreed to live your life for him and do what he says. That's why we were talking about before. Those that love me will do my commands. Verse 11. Then the angel of God spoke to me in a dream, saying, Jacob? And I said, Here I am. And he said, Lift your eyes now and see. All the rams which leap on the flocks are streaked, speckled, gray, spotted. For I have seen all that Laban is doing to you. I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed the pillar, and where you made a vow to me. Now arise and get out of this land, and return to the land of your family. Now you remember when we were talking about lifting your eyes. If God tells you to lift your eyes, he's about to give you a vision. So he is telling them, see all this with the speckled and the streaked flocks, I've done all this for you. And he identifies himself as the God of Bethel. And if we remember, when he slept in Bethel, he put a rock under his head. He saw Jacob's ladder with God up at the top and angels descending and ascending on this ladder. Well, we found out that he is the ladder. Jesus is the ladder. So he said, God is surely in this place. He took the pillow stone, stood it upright, and then anointed it with oil as the anointed one. And he called it Bethel. This is the house of God. That's what that means. So he is identifying with God, but this God is now up in Laban's camp. In other words, you don't have to go back to the first place that you saw God. God will know where you're at and come to you. Okay? Now we learn the answer to the odd actions Jacob did to enlarge his flocks. It was a supernatural revelation from God that told Jacob how to increase his flocks. He identifies himself as the same God that Jacob saw back at Bethel. This shows God will meet you where you are, and you don't have to go out to an upright stone where we saw him first. Again, we see if God tells you to do something, he will protect you and provide for you to accomplish the task. So really and truly, if God tells you to do something that is outlandish, he is going to prepare you and equip you to do it. You don't have to worry about it. You just do what he says. And it will miraculously, you're going to see more miracles if you obey his commands than if you try to conjure something up on the side yourself. He will provide for you a way to do it. Or you didn't hear from God. Because if he tells you to do this, you're the hands and feet of God. So if he tells you to do it, he's going to provide for you and sustain you in what you're doing. If he tells you, how many people would voluntarily go into a Middle Eastern country right now and preach the Word of God? Most people are saying, I think I'd rather go to South America or something. I don't know about this Muslim stuff, you know. But if he tells you to do it, you're bulletproof until you're not.
Right.
When you're done with the task that he's done, you can be taken out. The two witnesses we find in Revelation, the two anointed ones, they were indestructible. They had fire coming out of their mouth and killed people until Satan came, basically, the beast, and killed them with wounds in their head, and they lay there for 3 days and then they rose. But when God was through with them and they did the job that they were sent to do, they were vulnerable. But until they did the job that they were supposed to do, they were indestructible. They couldn't be touched. 14. Then Rachel and Leah answered and said to him, Is there still any portion or inheritance for us in our father's house? Are we not considered strangers by him? For he has sold us, and also completely consumed our money. For all these riches which God has taken from our father are really ours and our children's. Now then, whatever God has said to you, do it. Then Jacob rose and set his sons out and his wives on camels, and he carried away all of his livestock and all the possessions which he had gained, his acquired livestock, which he had gained in the Padan Aram, to go to his father Isaac in the land of Canaan. So now his wives had come to him and said, Look, we were sold like strangers would be sold as slaves. This was not a marriage. We've already talked about the difference between a bride price and him working labor off to get his daughters. When there's a bride price paid, that money is for the wife. So that if something goes south in the marriage, he gets an inheritance. But as it was, Laban came with a shirt on his back. He had nothing. And so all he had was his labor. So he made a deal to marry Rachel for 7 years of labor. Then when he found out he got married, he had Leah. Well, the firstborn is the one that has to get married here. Then he had to work another 7 years for Rachel, the one he really wanted. Then he talked him into another 6 years of tending his flocks. And that's where he jiggled the numbers. And then he said, I'm ready to go home. So when he jiggled the numbers, the sons of Laban were like, well, he's taking everything we have, you know. So it was kind of a 20-year effort to get to where they've gotten. But now the women are saying, if something happens to Jacob, we don't have anything, because everything belongs to Laban. So he's going to Laban and going to say, I need to go home. We see here that Rachel and Leah were not happy with the way their father dealt with them either. They were basically sold to Jacob for labor. This was not the way a daughter was supposed to become a wife. If they ever left, Laban had all their wealth and they leave with nothing. Jacob was the sole provider for them and their children. Why stay any longer? Verse 16 is important. They both see that God has blessed Jacob and trust God enough to follow God's command. They also defer to their husband, which is a signal they knew the man of the house as the spiritual leader of the home. This is a huge reason we're not to marry unequally yoked. If your husband is a pagan, his advice will usually be flawed and against the will of God. So we see that these two pagan girls that were brought up in idol worship and everything start to see Jacob be blessed by his God. And so they're becoming believers. And they're saying, I'm with Jacob. Whatever he's doing, that's what I want. Verse 19. Now Laban had gone to shear his sheep, and Rachel had stolen the household idols that were her father's. And Jacob stole away, unknown to Laban the Syrian, in that he did not tell him that he intended to flee. So he fled with all that he had. He arose and crossed the river and headed towards the mountains of Gilead. And Laban was told on the third day that Jacob had fled. Now, these household idols are called teraphim. And they're a little more than just gods. What they do is, let's say for instance that I was an idol worshiper, and I had my idols, and someone came and stole them. Then when I die, they could come up and say, I own everything that you have. It was a kind of a deed, as well as something that they worshiped, but it gave them everything. So Rachel, by taking his teraphim, or his idol, could come back and not give anything to the son. She would be like an executor of the will. And so she had the control of everything.
I'm glad nobody can steal my God.
Right.
There you go. Well, if you carve it and stick it in your pocket, I guess it's not good. Of course, he doesn't speak to you, I don't think. So Laban went to shear his sheep and found out Jacob had fled. Rachel had gone to Laban's home and stole his idols. Some explanation is due on what the word idol means in verse 19. Rachel and Leah had already stated they felt robbed as previous verse. In that day, whoever possessed the family idols showed ownership of the family wealth. If Laban died and Rachel showed up with these idols, she would be the executor of the family will. Remember, Jacob already had his brothers wanting to kill him. Now his wife stole the family jewels to make Laban angry enough to do the same. So now he's got trouble in front of him and he's got trouble behind him. He's kind of stuck. If Rachel hadn't stolen family idols, Laban probably wouldn't have followed him. The agreement had already been made, but this was a game changer. Verse 23. When he took his brethren with him and pursued him for 7 days' journey, and he overtook him in the mountains of Gilead, but God had come to Laban and the Syrian in a dream by night, and said to him, be careful that you speak to Jacob neither good nor bad. So God comes and speaks to an idol worshiper and tell him, be careful what you say to Jacob. So God does speak even to lost people. But I always wonder, if you hear the voice of God, why don't you change your ways? But he doesn't anyway. So Laban went after Jacob, but God told Laban to treat Jacob neither good nor bad. Here again, God speaks to an idol worshiper, and the idol worshiper is not transformed. I have to wonder if these little carved sticks ever spoke to him. Verse 25. So Laban overtook Jacob. Now Jacob had pitched his tent in the mountains, and Laban with his brethren pitched in the mountains of Gilead. And Laban said to Jacob, what have you done that you have stolen away unknown to me, and carried away my daughters like captives, taken with a sword? He's not even recognized that they're married. You've taken away my daughters like you're captive with a sword. Why did you flee away secretly and steal away from me and not tell me? For I might have sent you away with joy and songs and timbrel and harp. I'd have thrown a going away party if you'd have just told me. Well, that's a lie, you know. So he is basically saying that you really made me angry and everything. And you would not allow me to kiss my sons and my daughters. Now you have done foolishly in so doing. So now the sons and daughters are really his grandchildren. That's what he's talking about. He would have said goodbye to, well, we know there's 11 males and at least one female. I don't know how many there were. It is in my power to do you harm. So here comes the threat. But the God of your father spoke to me last night, saying, be careful that you speak to Jacob neither good nor bad. The God of your father, not his father. See? And now you have surely gone because you greatly long for your father's house. But why did you steal my gods? Bingo, there it is. In other words, he followed him for 7 days, not for his grandkids or his daughters, or he didn't care. But you got my gods. And now you've messed up big time, you know. So Laban catches up with Jacob and speaks to him, acting like he had nothing but goodwill for Jacob, but cuts to the chase and wants his gods back. Laban threatens him, saying he could do harm to Jacob, but God told him not to. Verse 31. Then Jacob answered and said to Laban, because I was afraid, for I said, perhaps you would take your daughters from me by force. So even Jacob is admitting that he knows how he is, and he's going to rob him. He's not going to be fair with him. So he decided, I'm going to get the heck out of Dodge. With whomever you find your gods, do not let them live. In the presence of your brethren, identify what I have of yours and take it with you, for Jacob did not know that Rachel had stolen them. I wanted to stop here and talk a little bit about curses. With whomever you find your gods, do not let them live. And Rachel, the one he loved, this was his true love, the one he wanted in the first place. He didn't really want Leah. He said, do not let them live. She died in childbirth, the next child. So he put a curse on his own wife, not knowing that she had taken them. Now Rachel had taken the household idols and put them in a camel saddle and sat on them, and Laban searched all about the tent but did not find them. And I gave Leviticus 15, 19 through 20 for this next law. And he said to her father, she said to her father, let it not displease my Lord that I cannot rise before you, for the manner of women is with me. And he searched but did not find the household idols. So she had them in a saddlebag and was sitting on them, and she was supposed to be on her monthly period. And if he touched her during this time, he would be ritually unclean. But this is before Leviticus, before the law was ever written in anything. This just shows you that God had already put out these things before it was ever written down. That's why Abraham tithed till Melchizedek and all these other things way before it was ever written down. Jacob wasn't aware that Rachel had taken the idols, so he made a bold statement to kill whoever had them. Jacob allowed Laban to rifle through all their stuff, but Rachel had hidden them in the camel saddle and was sitting on them. So she told Laban she was on her period, so he couldn't touch her, or he would be ritually unclean. Imagine what he would have done if he would have known that the idols were underneath her, and she was making them unclean. Okay? Then Jacob was angry and rebuked Laban. Now he's going to get a little backbone here. And Jacob answered and said to Laban, what is my trespass? What is my sin, that you have so hotly pursued me? Although you have searched all of my things, what part of your household things have you found? Set it here before my brethren and your brethren, that they may judge between us both. So you're saying, you are accusing me and you didn't find anything. So what are you going to do about it? These 20 years I have been with you. And here he's naming it. Like I said, he got to Laban's house at 87, and now he spent 20 years there at least. Let's see. These 20 years I have been with you. Your ewes and your female goats I have not miscarried their young, and I have not eaten the rams of your flock. While he was watching the sheep, if he said, let's go get a ram, why wouldn't you take it from Laban instead of your own? He said, I didn't do that. I was fair with you, and I took one of my own. And all this time, you've been blessed because the ewes would not have miscarriage during this time. That which was torn by beasts, I did not bring to you. I bore the loss of it. You required it from my hand, whether stolen by day or stolen by night. In other words, if a wild animal got one of yours, I took it out of mine and replaced it. more than fair is what he's trying to say. There I was in the drought, the day the drought consumed me, and the frost by night, and my sleep departed from my eyes. In other words, I've given you all I can give you. I was out there 24/7, freezing to death, burning up in the daytime, doing what I was supposed to do. Thus I have been in your house 20 years. I served you 14 years for your 2 daughters and 6 years for your flock. And now you've changed my wages 10 times. Unless the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had been with me, surely now you would have sent me away empty-handed. God has seen my affliction and the labor of my hands and rebuked you last night. So he is saying, because Laban feared the God of Abraham and feared the God of Isaac and his God, he would have stolen everything from him, because he's just a cheater, you know. So Jacob gets a backbone and rebukes Laban because they haven't found anything stolen from Laban. He gives his side of the story to try to make Laban feel bad that he was out there in the weather and heat helping Laban. He wouldn't even eat an animal from Laban's flock, and when one was killed, Jacob took the loss. Verse 41 gives us some information we need to keep track of Jacob's life. He was 87 when he came to Laban, and he served him for 20 years. He is at least 107 when he leaves for home. Jacob tells Laban that if it weren't for the fear of God and Isaac's retribution, Laban would take everything from him. If he had come out there and caught him and took his wives and his children and everything else, I think Isaac has enough army back at camp that he would have gone after Laban himself. So he had fear of what Isaac would do to him. 43. And Laban answered and said to Jacob, these daughters are my daughters, and these children are my children. This flock is my flock. All that you see is mine. But what can I do this day to these my daughters, or to the children whom they have borne? Now therefore come and let us make a covenant, you and I, and let's be a witness between you and me. So Jacob took some stone and set it up as a pillar, and Jacob said to his brethren, gather stones, and they took stones and made a heap, and they ate there on the heap. So he is basically confessing that I would have taken everything that you had. He said, these are all of my daughters, all of my kids, all of my flocks, and you've taken them. But to keep from killing you, because you're married my daughters and everything, we're going to make a covenant. So they set up rocks, and they would take tall rocks that would lay on the side, and they would stand them up. And he made this wall of stones out there. And in the particular Bible study I was looking at when I made all this, they're still there. Because you can go to Israel and Gilead and go up on the mountain and there's those rocks. Now somebody could have read this 1,000 years ago and said, you know, I'm going to go stand some rocks up and everything. But it gave me inspiration to know that they're still there. They're all weather beaten and everything. It looks really old. But like I said, it could have been 100 years after this. Maybe somebody went out and did it themselves. But I still like the idea that they're there. Laban showed the true intent of his heart, and Jacob, telling Jacob everything is mine. He wasn't even recognizing Jacob's marriage to his daughters and would have taken the children. After blowing off steam, he decided to make a covenant between him and Jacob. 47. Laban called it Jagar Sadutha, but Jacob called it Galid. And Laban said, this heap is a witness between you and me this day, therefore its name was called Galid. Also Mizpah, because he said, may the Lord watch between you and me, and when we are absent from one another. If you afflict my daughters, or if you take other wives besides my daughter, although no man was with us to see, God is witness between you and me. Then Laban said to Jacob, here is the heap, and here is a pillar, this pillar, which I have placed between you and me. This heap is a witness, and this pillar is a witness, that I will not pass between this heap and you will not pass beyond this heap and this pillar to me for harm. So basically, they have made an agreement that you don't pass this line, and I won't pass, and we'll all get along. But if you pass this line, I have the right to kill you and your family. Now, a Mizpah is an agreement between two people. If you've ever gone to a Christian bookstore, they will have a chain with a coin on it, and it's going to be cut in two with a sawtooth pattern. That's called a mitzvah. It's going to have Genesis 31:49 on it, the saying. And you find the one you love, and you give one half, and you keep the other half. Well, a mitzvah here is I'm going to kill you if you come near me, and you can kill me if I come near you. And yet, for whatever reason, they don't understand that that's what this is saying. They say that we're tied together because I love you and you love me, but that's not what the verse means. The verse means that God is a witness here and He is going to keep it square. So if you cross over this line, I have the right to kill you. That's what He's saying. Galid means heap of witnesses or a heap of testimony. In the rest of the Bible, it will be Gilead. So Gilead and Galid are the same name. It's just one way of saying it. They make a pledge to keep the pledge even when they're not together. God would be watching them both. So the pledge is that God is going to be watching. The end of the pledge basically says, here's a line. You don't cross it and I won't cross it. Another thing to see here is verse 49 speaks of mitzvah. Christian gift shops will sell you a coin or a chain that has a sawtooth pattern on it, cutting the coin in two with verse 49 on it. It is supposed to mean true love. But as we see here, they would be free to kill each other if they cross the line. Making a covenant with God as a witness is not always a sweet thing. They were pledging that if one crossed the line, the other was free to kill them and their family.
That's part of true love.
Right.
Don't you cross the line.
So anyway, not every covenant is a nice thing. You're making agreements, legal binding agreements is what it's about. Verse 53, the God of Abraham, the God of Nahor, and the God of the father judged between us, and Jacob swore by the fear of his father Isaac. So here we see God of Abraham, which is the God of the Bible, and the God of Nahor, which is an idol. See? So they're making an agreement, and he's swearing on a stick or an idol. But the God of Abraham is in on this. And he says, and their father judged between us. And Jacob swore by the fear of his father Isaac. So he knows that Isaac is with the right God. 54. Then Jacob offered a sacrifice on the mountain and called the brethren to eat bread. And they ate bread and stayed all night on the mountain. And early in the morning Laban arose and kissed his sons and daughters and blessed them. And Laban departed and returned to his place. Laban names off all the gods, including the God of Abraham, to swear by. So they make an agreement. Notice here that the God of Abraham and Isaac was invoked. And later we will know that Jacob fully accepts the same God. When we get there, we will see Jacob wrestle with the angel of God, capital A, as all Christians must do at some point to dedicate our lives to the true God of the universe. When we truly meet with God, our name and our nature will change. Knowing about God is different than knowing Him. You see here that even an idol worshiper hears God's voice and keeps on serving idols. And the next week, we're going to be talking about Jacob wrestling with basically Jesus. A theophany, or God, or whatever you want to name it. It's definitely a deity. But he says that I met with God and saw Him face to face and didn't die. And so he wrestled with Him all night. Now, it's kind of a strange verse unless you start listening in a spiritual sense. Because he has death in front of him and he has death behind him. And yet God told him to go home. So the wrestling match is, what should I do? And so he clings to God and wrestles with Him all night, saying, bless me. I won't let you go until you bless me. I'm giving you next week's stuff. But every Christian at some point has to take their foot out of the world and put it into the kingdom. And what he is doing is trying to keep one foot in the kingdom and believe on his Father's God. But God has visited him personally. Now, There's a difference between knowing what your daddy told you and meeting with God. So he is learning now that things are going to be required of him to trust God. This is, to me, this picture, when we get to the wrestling of Jacob, is just as important as the binding of Isaac. When Abraham bound Isaac to the altar and was about to slay his own son, that was the maximum amount of faith that he could have. He said, he's made promises to me. The only way he can keep him is to either bring him back to life or provide me another thing to sacrifice. So he was totally confident that God would take care of it. He basically said, God, it's up to you. You made the promises. So I'm going to go do what you told me to do, and we'll see how you figure it out. If there's nothing too hard for God, then he can bring him back to life. That's what he's thinking about. Jacob offered a sacrifice on the mountain, and they shared bread and stayed all night there. This covenant sacrifice would be the same one God and Abraham shared when Abraham cut animals in half and God walked in a figure eight between them. You remember when God swore on his own self, his own name, he put Abraham to sleep, slaughtered animals, cut them in half, and the Spirit of God walked in a figure eight pattern as he repeated the covenant between them. That's exactly what they did here. That's the way they made this covenant.
That's the infinity sign now.
Right, forever. Some say this may be on Mount Gilead, but we can't be for sure. They have found a line of several upright stones there. Someone could have stood them up later, but it does uplift my spirit to see stones standing up apparently thousands of years after being written about in Scripture. It's the same thing as finding Sodom and Gomorrah with doubters saying it never happened, to today where they are excavating the site. People, even Christians, are saying, well, it's a metaphor, and it didn't really happen. Or it didn't happen because of what God, or what the Bible says. But now they're excavating Sodom and Gomorrah. And it's nothing but sulfur in the ground. You can pick up sulfur things and actually light it with a match. And it's all over, and they're finding skeletons burnt completely up. Nothing left but ashes and sulfur there. And they know it's in the exact place where Sodom and Gomorrah is supposed to be, and yet people deny it even happened. That's why aren't we frightened to death when the Supreme Court says it's okay for gays to marry? We're pronouncing a curse on our own country where we're going to raise our families and stuff. People, you have talking heads on TV and they just went to church because they got the little X, the little cross up here with ashes, and yet they're for gay marriage. 60% of America is for gay marriage, and yet 80% are Christian. Somebody's lying.
Yeah.
So, these kinds of things, abortion, hardly anybody made a peep when they brought abortion about. No one said anything when they took prayer out of school. Why aren't they still marching in the streets to get prayer back into school, Bible reading? In the 1950s, in Dallas schools, you could take a course on Bible study, and believe me, I've seen the book. And most preachers couldn't answer the questions that a high school student in the 50s had to answer. I'm telling you, it's that deep. And we've lost that completely. The Bible has proven to be very accurate historically and geographically, but they won't even allow it in schools. Another thing I felt significant was the tradition that women in menses were ritualistic unclean at this time. Try to imagine what it would have happened if Laban knew Rachel sat on his idols, if she really was on her period. We don't know if she was lying or not, but if she really was, I'm sure it would have been Berserk City. It would have been 500 years, it would be 500 years later that Moses would write that same law in the Bible. As we see, sacrificing animals, tithing, and many other traditions were happening long before they appeared in writing. So next week, we'll go on with Laban and his wrestling with God.